Hi everyone, in today's painting tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint Lord Solar Leontus, the master of the Astra Militarum. The jury is out as to whether it's a good looking miniature, but I think it looks pretty cool with his wind up horse and suited looking helmet. In this video I'll show you how to paint him using this colour scheme, and I will be using an airbrush, but that can be replaced with a rattle can. So let's get into it. Right, so I choose to component paint this miniature, doing bits separately with a horse held in place with some blue tack on the two hooves. Likewise, the horse's armour will for now be stuck in place with blue tack. I did put a couple of extra components onto the base as I've got plenty of spare, and you can see his head is done separately with a piece of wire going into a wine cork. Now his cape is then blue tacked onto a piece of sprue, and his torso is also likewise held in place with some wire and wine cork again. Now the extra thing I've done is magnetised his right arm. I've seen other people have problems snapping off his sword, given how delicate it is. So having it magnetised will add some obvious give and hopefully avoid it being snapped off in the future. Right, so now into painting the miniature. I've undercoated him with matte black by Army Painter, and I did this via my airbrush. If you don't have an airbrush, you could also use simply a rattle can, a spray can from Citadel, or Army Painter as well. Either method makes sure you're covering all the miniature in matte black. Now next we're using a method called zenithal highlighting, and that's where you take a lighter colour, in this case matte white from Army Painter, and spraying it over the top surfaces of the miniature. What this will help to do is make any brighter colours or oil colours appear a bit more brighter on the top of the miniature, where light will reflect as opposed to any of the shadowing area. Again, I'm using an airbrush, but you could use a rattle can in this case as well. And once that's all dry, it's then on to using Elven Gold by Metal Alchemy. Now, at this point I'll call out that I've got my airbrush on way too high the pressure, which means I'm overspraying a lot, as you can probably see a bit from the distance here. Now again, you could use a rattle can. The thing with a rattle can is it's even less precise than using an airbrush, because you'd just be painting like basically a Custodes model. At the end of the day, you want to make sure the gold is hitting all of the appropriate armoured areas, so obviously the armour on the horsey, and also armour on Lord Solar himself as well. As said, the airbrush pressure I've got here is a bit too high, which means I'm basically painting the entire miniature gold. And if you are going to use an airbrush, make sure you whack down the air pressure probably to below 10 psi. But again, if you're using a rattle can, you'll just be spraying the entire miniature gold, but that's okay. Okay, now it's painting his cloak. I'm using Mephiston red by Citadel base, again in an airbrush. Now this is where I probably would definitely recommend an airbrush, because this allows you to get a really nice layering of the red in all the nooks and crannies. And because we've zenithal highlight before with the white, it should make the top of the cloak a bit brighter than underneath. It's then on to using another paint, this one Hot Orange also by Vallejo, and this is getting out just the I'm going to call it the bumps on his cloak, which are the raised areas. You're being very precise here and making sure you're only hitting on the bumps of the cloak or the raised surfaces, and allowing the natural shadow to form, given we used Mephiston red before, on a black and also zenithal highlight on the raised curves. The next one is then using another Vallejo product called Orange Fire, which is very bright, or much brighter. And this again is a very precise application on the raised curves of the cloak. You'll see it when the miniature is shown off at the end, but the cloak looks really quite vibrant, being very precise in how you apply this brighter orange only on the raised curves or bumps of the cloak. Right, so once the gold is all finished from the airbrush, it's now on to actually make it look quite nice and shiny. So first we're dry brushing with Sigmarite, the Citadel dry brush paint. Obviously hit all of the horse's armour and also Lord Solar himself. Do make sure you hit all of it quite nicely, because this is what gives the edges all the bit of definition. Then you'll be using Reichland Fleshade, the Citadel shade paint, and you're carefully applying it to all the nooks and crannies of the armour. So as you can see here, I'm carefully putting it onto the emblems on the horse's rear armour, and make sure you cover off all of the Lord Solar himself as well. Now don't just go whack it on wholesale, you need to be quite precise applying it, because you want any of the larger flatter areas still retaining that nice gold finish. And once that's all dry, you're then dry brushing again, this time with Polish Gold by Vallejo. Can you believe there's different shades of gold? And certainly this gold is the brightest I've come across. You are actually trying to, as per the name, polish the gold and give it a nice shiny finish. So the Sigma right before picks out the edges, and then the polished gold gives it the shine. And of course, the Reichland Flesh Shade is giving you the definition of all the nooks and crannies. So yep, go nuts and hit it as much as possible with your polished gold. Okay, for the next section of the video, I'll be painting just the horse itself before moving on to Lord Solar and finally the base. So I'm using matte black again by Army Painter to basically paint all the other sections of the horse, excluding of course the armor plating. At this point, I take off the blue tacked on armor plates to help me get at all of the relevant areas and avoid getting black on any of the armor plating. So go through basically touching up the entire miniature with matte black. And the key point here is several thin coats, not one or two thick coats, because we're all about thin coats when we're painting miniatures. Then using Gunmetal by Army Painter, we now touch up or go at all the silver aspects of the miniature. So there's extensive jointing in the horse's leg, at the bottom of its hoof. There's also silver on its left eye, and likewise there's also some cabling up and down its neck. Do your very best at any point here to avoid getting any paints on the gold, because you want to have the gold left as it is as best as possible. Then you're using Rhino Hide by Citadel to paint the saddle, and there's also two harnesses coming back from the horse's mouth on the left side, which is attached to an armor plate, likewise also on the right side, which is an individual piece. I then come back with Gunmetal again and pick out all the silver rivets, which is plenty across the horse. I find by doing these silver helps to sort of give the horsey that look of like armored plating, which has been screwed in place onto its organic flesh. And very finally, as far as base coating to a degree is concerned, I use Citadel contrast paint Black Templar. Now this I apply onto any of the what we could call fur or organic skin of the horse, which actually isn't a lot. So you're doing the tail and do several layers on this, and likewise the ears. Now it's a very, very subtle effect using this contrast paint on black. You could probably actually not bother, but it's a really subtle effect, which I think helps to add a bit more of a differentiated look between the silver on the horse's body and what is probably an organic tail, and likewise the ears as well. And to help pop the detail of the silver aspects, I'm using Nuln Oil on all of the silver joints on the horse, and likewise the cabling on the horse's neck. So just pausing here, with all the base layers done, I've glued back on the armor plating on the horse. Quick point here is I've painted the left eye with a robotic eye with Mephiston red, and then on the right eye, which is a real eye, it's a dash of white and a very small dot of black for the pupil. Given it's a big horse eye, it's much easier to do than little human eyes. Then we do some edge highlighting on the horse and start off with Corvus black. You're doing edge highlights on all of the sharp edges on the horse's legs and also around the head area. Then move on to further using Dark Reaper by Citadel to reinforce that edge highlight you just did with Corvus black. And when using Dark Reaper, you're using it less so than Corvus black, obviously, because Dark Reaper is a brighter contrast compared to the black. And then from there, it's now highlighting the silver using Stormhost Silver by Citadel, again picking out the any of the silver elements, picking out the edges. And then we're moving on to the leather straps or the harness, and also the saddle. And here we're using Doombull Brown by Citadel, again picking out any of the edges on the harness and also the saddle. Okay, now onto painting Lord Solar himself. I'm using matte black to paint his boots, sword scabbard, pistol holster, and his gloves. You would have seen there's a glove attached to the harness, which is now on the horse, and that's obviously been painted black as well. Also paint his face black as well, because this will be the base coat for another paint at a later stage. Using Rhino Hide again, you're painting all leather straps, including on his belt, and also those that go down to his stirrups. Now we're using Gall Vorbak red to paint the bits of clothing which hang to the left and right of him, and you need to use several coats here, again being thin coats. And then it's using matte white to go over the remaining aspects of his clothing. Now key here is to use several thin layers, and I emphasize thin. Given you're painting over the contrasting gold, you need to do several thin coats. So make sure you take your time here, do several thin ones. Do not put on one thick, heavy white coat of paint. Then using Mephiston red, you're painting the cloak, which starts on his shoulders, And also on the little bit of cloth which hangs down to the left of him, at the end of those strips, you're painting the red little tassels as well. Then using gunmetal again, you're picking out any silver elements, and this will include the stirrups, which he puts his feet into, and also his pistol. Cool, now we're using Macragge blue by Citadel to paint this power sword. And then very lastly, using Bugman's glow to paint his face. Now moving on to shades, we're using Nun oil again. Now being very, very careful, we're applying it to all the join points between the white, the silver, the black and the red, and we're applying it very sparingly here to help draw a bit of shadow or definition in there. You of course use the silver on any metallic areas, including the pistol and also the stirrups, and you're also going to carefully apply it to his sword as well. Then using Rhinox Fleshtones, we're applying it of course to his face. And onto edge highlighting. So rinse and repeat as per the horse. We're using Corvus black and then Dark Reaper on any black edges, including his boots, the sword scabbard and also the pistol holster. Then also using Stormhost silver, again highlighting all any silver aspects, so mostly the stirrups and also elements of his pistol. And then touching up the darker reds using Mephiston red on the edges of what I assume is some sort of fancy cloak thing. And then we're going to reinforce the white. So we've applied the Nun oil to help get the bit of definition between any of the white surfaces and gold. I'm using matte black, which has been watered down to basically reinforce that white. So I suggest at this point you go over all the white again, being quite deliberate, and really making sure the white stands out nice and bright. Okay, now to painting his eyeballs. I basically fill out his entire eye socket with matte white. If you make mistakes with a matte white, you can clean it up with your Bugman's glow, and you're using your finest tip paintbrush. Do have a go at this. His eyeballs aren't the smallest out there. If you're painting guardsmen, his eyeballs actually aren't too small. But do have a go, make sure the paint is correctly thinned down, it flows well off the paintbrush, and if you want to check it, just use it up against your fingernail to see how it flows. Then from there you're picking out your pupils, so hyper precise work. You need to stabilize your fingers as per you can see I've done there, and basically make sure his eyes look in the same direction. Pretty obvious there. Again, water the paint down accordingly, make sure it flows nicely off the brush and the brush is not overloaded. Do your very best to make sure he's looking the same way, not looking like a fishman. Okay, then we're going to highlight his remaining skin features, and you're mixing Cadian flesh tones with your Bugman's glow. Never ever use straight Cadian flesh tone, it's too contrasting, so mix it with some Bugman's glow. Use your fine tip paintbrush and pick out things like his nose, his lips, and also his cheekbones if you can get to them. One of the smaller details before you glue them all together is actually on the cloak. There's two Imperial Eagles showing on the outside and also inside. I simply use matte white here, and then I followed up with some Nun oil to reinforce any of the detail. Okay, back to the airbrush to finish off the sword. Now firstly, I've used some hobby tape, which is basically very low stick tape to protect the golden aspects and the painted aspects of his arm. And you are now using Alaitoc blue, a Citadel layer brush, as a first layer. Now when you do this, obviously use a lower air pressure than I did before, and you want to be hitting the top of the sword, so leaving the bottom of it, just showing the Macragge blue. Then repeat the same process, but this time using Baharroth blue. And again, you're only hitting the top of the sword, so leaving both the Alaitoc blue and the Macragge blue at the bottom to be showing through. This gives the impression of some sort of power sword as it lights up and gets all hot and spiky at the top to slay some heretics. Okay, at that point I now assemble Lord Solar, and he's sat safer to the side, and I finish off the base. So basically I'm using matte white on the ruined piece of building, and likewise also gunmetal on any of the metallic parts of the slain Titan. Other things to call out is that I also use True Copper by Army Painter around the edges of the Titan's facial features, and likewise any other details such as there's a bit of red on the ruin and I'm also dry brushing any spare metallic pieces I've got lying around on the base. I then apply washes to the base, and on the white ruin wall I'm using Agrat's Earthshade, and this is then also applied on the copper as well. Once that's all dried, I use a technical paint by Citadel called Nihilakh Oxide, can't pronounce that, but you are carefully dotting this on certain aspects of the copper itself. This illustrates or create like a rusting effect, so you're using quite a detailed brush here to dab it on, and if necessary use a bigger brush to wipe it away. You don't want to overdo this, but just put it on any of the rivets or damage points on the copper aspects. Alright, and there he is, fully assembled and ready for the tabletop. Hopefully you agree airbrushing the gold is definitely worth it, as it has quite a nice finish and definitely reflects nicely off the light source. Likewise, his cloak, I could never ever achieve that effect with a paintbrush. Definitely airbrushing is potentially cheating, but cheating sometimes looks great. Also, you can see the base definitely is worth doing all the detail. You could just probably dry brush the entire thing if you want to do it quickly, but picking out that copper of the Warlord Titan, likewise all the silver details, and the white, the dirty white of that ruin definitely is worth the effort. So hopefully you enjoyed this and found it helpful and inspires you to give a good go at painting Lord Solar Leontus. So any questions, put them in the comments, let me know and I'll hopefully help out. But if you enjoyed this, want to support me, you can do so with a like, comment, or by subscribing, or joining my Patreon platoon. So keep your bayonet sharp, lasgun oiled, faith in the Emperor strong, Patreon platoon, sound off.
Tank Commander Glenn, Tank Commander Mitchell, Tank Commander Watchdog Van Etten, Colour Sergeant DuPont, Sergeant Broxius, Adal, the Colonel Merrill, Veterans Gibson, Hall, Lundeen, Guardsman Beard, Coquelin, Flint, Hills, Malak, Nitton, Nguyen, Smith, Tom, Tompkin, Conscript Bosun, England, Gilliam, Goodwin.